Chapter 2. The Dog Who Caught the Car. You can't buy them all. In Chapter 1, I provided an example of a person, the young version of me, in their 20s buying real estate rental property, specifically a small multifamily apartment community of 16 units, and doing the evaluation or due diligence leading up to the purchase. Check it out if you haven't read it. Somebody recently asked me to talk about a memorable experience incurred while doing due diligence before purchasing a property that caused me not to buy a property. There were several, but one occurred around Halloween years ago that was particularly harrowing. It involved a large property we had under contract to buy located in Athens, Georgia. I recall that the property in question was 448 units, and I think it was called University Gardens somewhere back around 2005, and the site approximated 20 acres. I had 3 teams that split up to inspect every other unit, given the sheer size of the property. I don't recommend this plan. We should have inspected every single unit. But as it turned out, I'm rather glad we didn't in this case. Despite the large site, there was just one dumpster on the property located in the middle of it, and that was actually a trash compactor. If you are not familiar with the difference, a compactor compresses the garbage to about 1/8 of its volume, making for greater efficiency and fewer pickups. By contrast, a typical 8 cubic yard dumpster can only accommodate about a dozen apartments worth of household garbage when picked up twice a week. Not only is a multitude of dumpsters unsightly, even if partially screened by fencing and landscaping, but the weight of the trucks also quickly tears up the parking lot and driveways to and from each dumpster. So in theory, a single compactor for a large site such as this slows the need for major paving repairs. However, a drawback is that the tenants are often reluctant to carry their bags of garbage very far. So this particular property offered a concierge service on certain days to utilize golf carts to pick up the trash. Even so, the reality of a situation like this is that the tenants often leave their bags of trash just outside the door to their units. As soon as we realized the setup, we were pleasantly surprised not to see any bags of garbage sitting outside the apartments. When we commented about it to the on-site manager, she proudly proclaimed, "That's because I find the hell out of them if they do that." As we started doing the inspections, we quickly figured out that many tenants simply accumulated multiple bags of garbage just inside the front door. And as a result, many of the apartments we inspected stank to high heaven. One in particular was really bad, but when the maintenance man let us in to inspect it, the garbage had apparently already been removed. Though the adjacent unit also seemed to stink up the vestibule outside its front door, since we were only inspecting every other unit, we skipped that one. A week later, I was back in Athens once again, this time to meet with our environmental consultants who needed to take some paint and air samples from about a dozen units. The air samples were to check for radon gas, because if you are investing in certain places in the country where a particular type of subterranean rock exists, these rock formations potentially emit a gas where exposure over long periods of time can be harmful. Anyway, I arranged for them to enter certain units that my team had skipped the week before, including the one that seemed to smell so bad. Still, I didn't personally return to that particular unit, instead focusing on devising a game plan for something I deemed much more important. There was a great barbecue place nearby, and I remember glancing at my watch and hoping it was close enough to noon to break away and get some lunch for the team. It was about then that I heard the screaming. 2 environmental consultants, one male and one female, were sprinting across the grounds, with the woman easily outpacing the man, despite the fact that she had lost a shoe. As the woman ran past me, she didn't slow down to explain what was happening, but jumped into her car and left the property at a high rate of speed. When the man arrived, he explained between gasps for air that there was a dead body resembling Beetlejuice in that particular apartment. It was tragic, and a police and a hazmat team were quickly called in to investigate, remove the body, and decontaminate the entire building. I don't know about the female environmental tech, but the on-site manager quit the next day, and we chose not to buy the property. I later heard the tenant had died from natural causes. Nobody had checked in on him for weeks, and our lunch at the barbecue place might as well have occurred at the Sad Cafe. I went back and found the missing shoe, as well as the one the tech discarded in the parking lot. I kept those shoes on display in my office as a reminder of the event. That is, until my wife stopped by one afternoon and seemed to believe that visitors might think I was displaying them as a sordid trophy from my former career as a rock star. Yeah, right. I'll share more stories in later chapters, none of which will be this gruesome, and some of which will be downright hilarious, and probably most will leave you shaking your head, especially the one about the cachet of sex toys. You might ask why an isolated and highly unusual event like this caused us to rescind our purchase contract after this incident. Well, with 448 units, this was a very large deal for us, located 4 hours away, requiring an on-site staff. When the incident prompted the seller's staff to quit, I realized that I'd be perpetually held hostage by the future staff threatening to quit for any reason at any time. If it happened suddenly, like in this instance, then we'd be forced to compromise other assets by temporarily siphoning talent to babysit the deal until we could hire relief. In my humble experience, a good hire takes weeks, if not months, to find, and it often takes years to know for sure. It was at that point in my career that I realized my specialty was smaller assets that could be off-site managed. This meant, for me, any asset I intended to buy and hold onto for a year or more needed to be located within an hour's drive. I jumped ahead of myself with the Beetlejuice story. Before you seriously consider buying rental property, you should clearly define what your goals are for the investment. For the versions of me in my 20s and 30s, I usually wasn't interested in flipping and planned to hold on to the assets I purchased long enough to avoid being deemed by the IRS to be a merchant investor. That designation meant an investor would not qualify for the more favorable long-term capital gains tax treatment at resale. To be clear, I was more interested in wealth building than in making a quick buck or three. Though I certainly hope to enjoy passive income, or what is sometimes described on YouTube as a side hustle, which generates income even when you sleep, in my 20s, I was more interested in building value by growing and holding on to the portfolio of proximate properties that I could more efficiently staff and operate. I did this using a technique called leveraging. In the first chapter, I talked briefly about one aspect of the 16 units I bought as my first investment property. While kicking the tires, I quickly determined that the rents being charged were way below market. A survey of rents and comparative analysis of competitive properties, i.e., a market study, can be a very helpful tool, though I typically did the research myself after paying good money for several that involved a team from out of town that showed up in expensive suits and dresses and thought their knowledge automatically applied to every local market. Though this can be true occasionally, it can also be completely off base at other times. To think a team of 2 or 3 young guns could swoop in and spend a day and a half in any market and then make meaningful 10-year projections is ridiculous. After sending thousands upon thousands of hard-earned cash flow to a company out of Columbus, Ohio called the Bettor Company or something of the sort, after a few years, I dropped them like a hot potato and hired only local consultants or did the work in-house. Getting back to my very first investment, the tenants I interviewed told me the rents were the cheapest in the neighborhood by far. I did a rent survey over the weekend and learned that even inferior properties were charging $100 a month more for the same floor plans as the subject property. You should look for those dynamics when you invest. It's a great value add. I'll go into detail later about how we handled rental increases in a manner that brought our rents back up to market levels without creating a hardship for our valuable tenants. It's a delicate tightrope balancing act, but there are tricks we employed to help. But this is just context for explaining what leveraging your investment portfolio means. Using the tricks I mentioned and working hard to put a spit shine on the grounds, common area hallways, and unit interiors as they turned over, in a little over 2 years, we doubled our rents while remaining fully leased. Several of the original tenants we inherited at purchase stayed with us and renewed year after year. Anyway, although I still had 3 years before my note was due, I went to a local bank and applied for a new loan that would equal 75% of an updated appraisal based on my new rent roll. When the new appraisal came back, I was shocked. It was 40% higher than I dare hoped it would be, and I must admit I strutted around my wife like a boss for a few days, acting like we just won the lottery. She remained unimpressed and said something to the effect of, "The game isn't over yet." We pulled enough cash out of the refinancing to have supper and drinks at Jubilee Seafood, pay off the seller, and buy 3 more properties in the neighborhood, in descending order of importance. The acquisitions were all close by but on different streets, and each was a 4-plex. We then repeated the exact game plan, and by continually leveraging new investments, we were able to consistently buy about a dozen units a year. Somebody is bound to ask why we preferred multi-tenant structures over buying single-family houses to rent out. For me, there were several reasons. First, I found I could operate a multifamily property much more cost-effectively than a single-family rental house. A simple singular example involves roof maintenance. Cloverdale is a canopy neighborhood, and the roofs need to be blown off at least twice a year. Doing that for a roof over a single house takes the same time and energy as for a 4-unit building that makes considerably more revenue. And this dynamic repeats itself often in other examples. By the way, avoid 2 things like the plague when you are considering a specific rental property: flat roofs and roofs with varying or excessive pitch. Trust me on that, but if you want to learn more, contact us. Another issue, at least in our market, is turnover expense and downtime. Both are almost always greater for a single-family rental house. Though we've had the occasional awful apartment tenant, you must check out an old movie called Pacific Heights starring Michael Keaton, Matthew Modine, and Melanie Griffith. Best wake-up call for would-be landlords ever. A far greater degree of tenant abuse happens in single-family rentals where neighbors, your other tenants, won't be next door to warn you about sawing or hammering or other destruction. Furthermore, we provide monthly pest control using a third-party service provider for our apartments at our cost. But, for several reasons, we don't do that for the houses. Once a month, we meet with the pest control technicians before and after every treatment and get a rundown on who is being naughty. We then call any offending tenants and demand correction, with the right to undertake a follow-up inspection clearly written into our lease. It helps to put a quick stop to damaging behavior, but the tenants in the houses have much more anonymity, which lets them get away with more. Furthermore, though the tenants in our houses generally stay for an average period of 4 years compared to an average of 3 for our apartments, in this market, the rental pool is much deeper for apartments, and people tend to make quicker decisions after touring one of our apartments over a house. No matter the nature of our location of rental properties, they all share one universal thing. Passive income doesn't exist when a property sits vacant. I mentioned techniques we've been able to successfully employ when we need to bring rents up and in line with the market. First, we go out of our way to let our tenants know how much we value their business, some more than others, and we are set up to offer a quick response to maintenance requests. So many of our competitors don't do preventative maintenance or make their tenants wait days or even weeks to respond to specific problems. If you're a go-getter, you gain an immediate differential advantage over your competition if you take this approach seriously, though it's admittedly a sacrifice of weekends and free time occasionally. We also reward our best tenants by offering them better renewal deals, and we tell everyone up front that we will charge a higher renewal rate for systemic bad habits that affect us or other tenants. I'm not talking about undesirable tenants, but rather those that perpetually require attention or are simply high-maintenance people. I just don't like drama. We also position our rents just under the top of the market for comparable places, and we've had folks indicate they'd be leaving us due to a rent increase, only to realize we still offered a better deal, so they ended up staying with us. Remember, turnover always costs time, money, and lost rent. But some turnover is good. We're comfortable turning a quarter of our units annually and do the work in-house after developing many tricks to mitigate the cost and do the turn quickly. So, you just bought your first rental property. Are you planning to self-manage your investment or hire a third-party manager? At times during my investment career, I've taken on consulting jobs that required me to travel extensively and be gone for extended periods. The money was too good to turn down, so I hired a third-party property manager to free me up. This never ended well for me. I had a Century 21 affiliate blatantly steal rents from us and charge us for supplies that went to other jobs. Not just a few supplies either. We also discovered a high volume of returns for cash refunds that were not deposited back into our account and maintenance charges for work that was never done. In another instance, I handed over a property that was 100% leased when the management company was hired, and I got it back a year later at an 80% occupancy. Within a couple of weeks of simply showing up to meet prospects, we were back to 100%, and I vowed not to hire a corporate manager ever again. In their defense, it's a thankless job. Most charge between 10 and 12% of collections for their fee, which isn't enough to sustain a business that has a lot of employee turnover. Also, many feel like if they do their jobs and make a property perform well, an owner will then be tempted to sell it, which means they will have worked themselves out of a job. Finally, most management agreements run for only a year, which essentially hinders a management company from accurately predicting their staffing needs from year to year. In summary, I wouldn't recommend buying an investment property if your success or failure hinges on the performance of a third-party corporate manager. Most will perform marginally at best. We had some limited success hiring individuals to manage a few of our assets, and hiring early retirees that still wanted to work part-time always worked better than hiring young folks just out of college. Another, but trickier option, is to see if the seller might want to continue managing the property you bought from them. That could succeed or fail epically, depending on the individual or individuals involved. So we felt handling our own management was the best way to ensure the maximum value appreciation. But then again, I don't play golf. Heads up, our next chapter might carry an R rating as I rehash another crazy experience that occurred during a different inspection. Reach out to me through BamaSoundMedia, contact at BamaSoundMedia.com, if you have questions or wish to share your experiences. While there, check out our song Breakaway, which I originally wrote about buying rental property and leaving the corporate job I despised.